Epic of Gilgamesh is literally the reason why I woke up. We wouldn't even be here today on this presentation if it wasn't for me stumbling across the Epic of Gilgamesh and being like, wait a second, is this a flood story? And doesn't this sound very similar to the Old Testament? And does every world culture in the world have a flood story? So it is probably the perfect one to do for today. So I want to start with how I first heard about Sumer. And I just shared Gilgamesh versus Noah. The root of all religion was my search. I was looking for the root of all religion. And as I was doing that, I found the story of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh meets Noah on his journeys. And I'm like, wait a second, Noah? How could that be? This is a story from the Sumerian text that talks about gods as if they were beings from the stars. How is it even possible that this monotheistic religion has any connection to this polytheistic religion? It seemed to me that advanced awarenesses of sciences and the universe were in the Mesopotamian scriptures. This took me to quantum physics and the exploration of vibration and frequency. I was seeing things just like this image in the back, where there's images of cymatics, sacred geometry, serpents with beams coming out of it. It looked like very advanced quantum physics. And the researchers, many of who we work with on Portal to Ascension, were also speculating upon them and doing research and saying that these were advanced of understanding of quantum physics, space travel. And it was very interesting to me that some ancient civilization could have any knowledge of sciences that we're only figuring out now. The Anunnaki story started my process of connecting source material to many ancient civilizations. Even the Moses story in 7th century BCE, there was a Neo-Assyrian text about King Sargon of Akkad. Sargon was the illegitimate son of a high priest and was put into a basket and sent drifting down a river. Even this, the Neo-Assyrians came down from Babylon, came down from Sumer. So all these stories were from older stories. So as I was looking for the root of religion, I also came across William Henry and Jordan Maxwell. And those were two of the people that really shifted my life. Opportunity to work a lot with William Henry and some with Jordan Maxwell. And that was in 2001 when I was introduced to the Sons of God. So that was how I got into learning about the Epic of Gilgamesh in 2001. So now let's go to the mid-century, 7th century BCE, okay, 7th century BCE, where in North Mesopotamia has become the most thriving civilization the world has ever seen at this point, so they say, okay? And that's because they've also misdirected us to make us feel that the cradle of civilization was this area. Empire expanded all the way to Egypt, the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 7th and 6th century BCE. You can see a map here of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And here is a map of the Syrian Empire. You can see it goes all the way to Egypt, Tanis, Memphis, Thebes. So the Syrian Empire, had a lot of, obviously, descendants from the Babylonians and the Sumerians, but goes all the way down, went all the way down to Thebes in around the 7th century BCE. And then we have the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the final stage, the 4th and final stage. And this is how big this empire got, right? And I'm showing you this because this is when the epic was discovered, rediscovered, if you will. So how it was discovered is there was a great library that included 30,000 clay tablets that attracted scholars from around the world to explore and research, 30,000 of them. The Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, named after Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Syrian Empire. It was built in 645 to 635 BCE, and his father wanted his son to have a library that would give him access to the expertise he relied on to run the empire. The Assyrian scholarship was focused on understanding the will of the gods. Therefore, the library focused on interpreting omens from the gods. And that's what it was. So they basically wanted to figure out what the gods really wanted to say. Let's look at these ancient scriptures and let's see what the gods want from us. The tablets had a history of Mesopotamia for thousands of years. So those 30,000 tablets in 7th century BCE had thousands of years of Mesopotamian history. There was a story in there, guys, and this story was of a king named Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh's quest had him confront monsters and gods and even immortals. At the end of the 7th century, the dynasty was extinct and tablets were lost to time for 2 millennia. So they were, obviously lost to time before 7th century BCE. They were discovered, and then after the dynasty went away, 2 millennia later, 2,000 years later, until it was rediscovered once again. Here's the Epic of Gilgamesh from the Assyrian Library to the British Museum. I got to go and visit the Epic of Gilgamesh 4 months ago. It was an emotional experience for me, for sure, just because, like, as I told you, it was the beginning of a lot of things for me. So now let's jump forward to Mesopotamia, 3rd millennium BC. 4th millennium BC, we see city-states pop up and flourish around this area. The largest was the mega site of Uruk that had a big cultural influence on the surrounding area. This is not the 7th century, 3rd millennium. So this is 3,000, 4,000 to 3,000 BCE. Okay, so we're talking about Mesopotamia and these city-states that came about in that area. Uruk, one of the large cities, revolved around hierarchies of temples, hierarchies of temple districts, each one for a different deity. Districts were distribution centers to give out fixed rations to the citizens. There was proto-cuneiform came from here, emerged at this time. Signs on clay tablets found in Uruk and throughout the Middle East. They say to us, they being conventional information, governments, authorities, and all that, that Sumeria is the cradle of civilization. The reason for that is they say that's where agriculture started. Now we have evidence that it started way before. They just haven't yet rewritten the history books, which is why we're here. And they have also, it was the oldest known religious scriptures or scriptures anywhere. So basically they were saying, around 5,000, 6,000 BCE, that's when we started writing things down. And we start seeing them in ancient Sumer, Mesopotamia. We start seeing proto-cuneiform, and this was supposedly the oldest form of writing. And again, I got to keep putting disclaimers here. Egypt is way older, and we have hieroglyphs in there for way, way older that can go back tens of thousands of years. So what they tell us, or even what a lot of people believe, that this is the cradle of civilization, I feel if there is going to be a cradle, it might be Egypt. Obviously, something further back than that, but Egypt is definitely dates much older than some of these sites. On the proto-cuneiform writings, we find evidence of receipts of goods such as grains, products, textiles. The Uruk system continued until 3100 BCE when it began collapsing, possibly from trade and issues and climate. We see the abandonment of cuneiform writing and ancient pottery styles had come back. So there was, at this time, they abandoned their writing form, okay? And the ways they used to do pottery, the older ways came back, less devolved ways. They started, so they were more advanced, and then they seem to have got less advanced in some levels. Jedmid Nasser was a region that maintained the cuneiform writing and kept evolving it. A common religious system was put in place, with the center being Uruk. So this is now the resurrection. Jedmid Nasser basically maintained the writing, and Uruk was back in its prime again from 3100 to 2900 BCE for around 200 years. What I'm doing here is I'm giving you the timeline, the linear timeline, if you will, of Mesopotamia, because Sumer, ancient alien theory, Anunnaki, all this stuff is based on what I'm showing you right now. And I mean, I don't have to tell you guys how much the whole concept of the Anunnaki and ETs visiting us and hybridization, genetic mutation from these beings is so prevalent in the world that we're in. So what I want to do with this presentation is also show you what the world looked like around then, and who were the people that were creating these tablets and discovering these tablets and translating them. So Gem Nasir clay tablets were dedicated to the goddess Inanna, who then became known as Ishtar, right? And Ishtar, the goddess of Easter. Easter and Ishtar, Easter came from Ishtar. Jedmet was so short-lived that there is a debate whether it was separate archaeological period or not. The early dynastic period, the Sumerians. So the Sumerians, we go back to around 3rd millennium BCE, 2900 BCE or so. There were urban areas being built. They also continued the legacy of Uruk. They had Ur, they had Umma, they had Kish, and all of these city-states were in competition for growth and more. They all had agricultural lands across the Tigris River that expanded 10 to 15 kilometers each direction. Agricultural lands, that big, massive operation. You can see a Sumerian clay tablet here at the bottom, right? And they had advanced information. You can see that thing that I circled there. There's another thing, like 2001, one of like probably like 3 months into my awakening process, I found this. And there's a 2 scale map of our solar system with all the planets in the positions that they are actually in when you look at our solar system in and the planet's actual positioning. So they had some sort of advanced knowledge there. And here is a map of ancient Sumer. You can see Uruk, which is the town that said Gilgamesh was from. Ur, Eridur, Kish. Each city was a dwelling place for a god, for gods and goddesses, and the deities began giving human-like traits. Each city was a dwelling place for gods and goddesses, and the deities began being given human-like traits, right? Made in his image. Well, we make God in our image, right? We make God vengeful God and all the emotional triggers that we have. And a lot of human traits are starting to be put onto the deities. The words En, Ensi, and Lugal were the titles of kings in Sumer. There was an increase in military building now. Before that, we didn't really see too much military building, competition, fighting, wars. And this goes into my whole Yuga cycle presentation, where we can show that there was a fall from a Yuga cycle into another Yuga cycle around this time. That as we were falling from this into this frequency, there was more competition and more contradiction and combating happening. Basically, wars were breaking out, militaries were being built. So this was around the time that there was an increase in military building in Mesopotamia. Relationships between the city-states became very complex. This right here is a picture. Let's see. Picture qualities of proto-cuneiform script became more symbolic and finally became a part of the Sumerian language. So the pictures became symbolic and then finally became the alphabet. As you see in the bottom, the pictures, and then on the right-hand side, you see the alphabet. The names of kings began being inscribed that date back beyond the Sumerian Empire to past empires that exist in Mesopotamia. So we have the Sumerian kings list. We have the long journey in history of the Sumerian scriptures that speak about their kings that came before them, right? And we have rulings of kings that aren't a part of the Sumerian kings list that seem like a very long time. And this is around the time that we start seeing that those creations were made. Now, whether they were speaking about a world kingdom, but just called it Sumer, maybe Atlantis or a greater civilization, or maybe they were boosting themselves up to be like, we live for this long, we're these great kings. Only us in the community can continue to speculate or channel what exactly that is. So here's the question: who was Gilgamesh? Well, he was the ruler of Uruk, son of a mortal king, Lugal Banda, and goddess Ninsun. He possessed superhuman-sized strength and possibly a giant. He was sometimes lustful and took advantage of women. The gods then created Enkidu to confront Gilgamesh. So Enkidu came down to confront Gilgamesh. He was presented as he was presented as a member of the first dynasty of Uruk. His father was spoke about as a phantom or a spirit. So just to break that down a tad bit, Gilgamesh was an ET hybrid human giant, pretty much. And The first dynasty of Uruk that dates back way far back, because that was even before the Sumerian times, because they said that they were there for so long. And his father was a phantom or spirit, a deity, a god, right? And we see this obviously a lot of times. We see with Zeus, we see with Indra, about these gods coming down to earth and mating with a human or another type of spirit and having a hybrid child. And Marguerite kind of touched on that as well. Enkidu is discovered by a hunter and civilized by having intercourse with a temple prostitute called Shamhat. So this is Enkidu was created to come and confront Gilgamesh for all the wrongdoings that Gilgamesh was doing. And Enkidu adopts human dress and manners and then goes to confront Gilgamesh, and they wrestle. They stop fighting and end up becoming best friends, right? But Gilgamesh says Enkidu is his axe by his side. So they become best friends. He comes down, they fight, and then they end up becoming best friends instead of taking each other out. And Enkidu is like, Gilgamesh's right hand. He's his axe by his side. And some stories, they say they loved each other like a wife, like they were actually lovers. Some say they were best friends. Then Gilgamesh goes to a cedar forest to slay a monster. When they're on their way back to Uruk, Ishtar, the goddess of love, wants to marry him. But Gilgamesh says no. She forces Anu, the sky god, to unleash the bull of heaven, creating devastation on earth. Enkidu, though, Gilgamesh's right-hand man, or monster, beast, beat the bull, and the gods convene and decide that he must die for slaying the bull. Like, you shouldn't have done that. We put that bull down there. So his fate is to die. Gilgamesh has such a huge grief that he stays with Enkidu for 6 days and 7 nights until maggots drop from his nose, because it's his best friend. He tears out of his hair and clothes himself in skin of wild animals and creates a statue in Enkidu's name. He goes on a quest to Mount Mashu at the ends of the earth and enters a tunnel in which he goes into a fertile land called the Garden of the Gods. There he kills a group of lions and clothes himself in their skin. He destroys the stone ones, and because there were stone beings as well there, and that he had to also kill, and goes across the waters of death to Utnapishtim with a boatman. He was instructed to cut down 120 trees and form them into poles to cross the waters of death. So this is the story of Gilgamesh's journey. And then when he arrives in Utnapishtim and his wife, when he arrived where Utnapishtim and his wife live, Gilgamesh resonates with him because they were similar and asks him how he received immortality, because Utnapishtim was immortal. Utnapishtim tells him of a flood sent by the gods to drown mankind. He had survived the floods, and Enlil granted him immortality. Utnapishtim says, if you can stay awake for 7 days and nights, you will get immortality. Gilgamesh fell asleep and did not make it. And the number 7 isn't just used there randomly. It's a really important number in many ancient texts. Utnapishtim gave him another chance and said, if you find a special plant in the ocean that will rejuvenate anyone, you can be immortal. He retrieves it, but a serpent steals it, and then he goes home and builds a great city wall. Gilgamesh does. Gilgamesh was also shown how the underworld looks and told he will be the judge of the dead in his future role. So Utnapishtim, by the way, is Noah. And he journeys into this place, onto this island, and he finds Noah, the survivor of this great flood. And he makes a connection with him, which is really interesting because Noah was supposedly the only person left in the world when you look at the future text that speaks about this, the Old Testament that speaks about it as well. But there was other people on the planet, and Gilgamesh was a giant. And here is a depiction. Gilgamesh and the boatman getting the logs in order to create a bridge. So what did they believe about him? They believed he was a monarch and he ruled about 2800 BCE, but believed not to be the original Gilgamesh. So there was someone in 2800 BCE called Gilgamesh that ruled in Sumer, but it's believed, and I believe, and I think it's pretty obvious for if you do any research on this, that the story goes back way further, and he was just given the name of Gilgamesh in honor of Gilgamesh. He is believed to be a myth by most scholars, Gilgamesh is. Uruk and Iana temple and Kulab have been extensively excavated and not come up with any archaeological evidence of his existence as of yet, or that we've been told about. A story of before Mesopotamia, but with familiar surroundings. So this part is important. Now, this is a general thing from ancient history texts. A lot of times people take everything ancient history super metaphorically, right? And then other people take it all entirely literally, right? And I gotta say, like, I gotta start saying this, quoting myself on this one, is that the truth is always somewhere in the middle. And what happens is a lot of these individuals have inherited, or civilizations have inherited information from old civilizations. And then when they update the stories, they use their own surroundings to explain it all. So a lot of times people throw the baby out with the bathwater because they see, oh, wait a second, they're talking about a story in 200,000 BCE, but they're talking about Uruk? Well, we know through carbon dating and archaeological evidence, Uruk was only around from 4,000 BCE to 2000 BCE. That's not even possible, right? Because they talk about Gilgamesh being from this place in Uruk and the Anunnaki landing in Sumer and all this stuff. But if the Anunnaki landed in Sumer, and that's 200, 300,000 year old story, and Sumer wasn't even around that whole time, or Sumer is, they say it is, the Sumerians called it, then how does that even reconcile? So what I've noticed from looking through a lot of scriptures is that many civilizations, they take ancient stories and they use their own surroundings, to use their own people in order to relate to it even more deeply, right? And it also gives them a sense of ego pride. I feel like this is our story, this is our legacy and our history. But I feel that these stories are stories, global stories. Another great example here is the story of the Ramayana, the Rama and Sita story in Indian scripture. And that story of Rama and Sita is a story about a whole entire planetary civilization. But all the information in there seems like it's in India. But when you look at the locations that they visit in there and the descriptions of it and the astrological alignments, you can see that they're speaking about different parts of the planet. So it's a great example of how they've taken a story that is about a global civilization, maybe Atlantis, maybe before, and then they put it into a story utilizing their own indigenous culture and cities and towns. So Iana district in the 3rd millennium BCE, there was a large temple there to Inanna. There was an invasion that happened about 24 to 23 BCE. Well, that's actually 2400 to 2300 BCE. And all the structures in this area could have been destroyed, which could have led to info about Gilgamesh. The Great Wall, or Uruk, which is around 9 kilometers, 500 hectares, and 9 meters thick, is not too much of this wall has been excavated, and no inscriptions on the wall to show who built it, and cannot find archaeological evidence of a date of this wall. Most other Sumer kings inscribed things that they created. So we see inscriptions all the time in Sumer. They really wanted people to know what they created and that they were behind this. But when we see the Great Wall in Sumer, we don't see any evidence of an inscription. And if we look at the Gilgamesh story, Gilgamesh supposedly left from trying to be immortal with Noah and came back to Sumer in order to build the Great Wall. When we enter the later part of the early dynasty period, we start finding his name on a tablet with a list of gods from the 24th and 26th century BCE. There's been a heroic figures on the tablet from 3rd millennium BCE all the way to the 7th millennium that look like Gilgamesh and Enkidu. some of which the hero is in lion skin. It was not written down, so we could have possibly been passed down verbally for thousands of years. So now we're getting into the dating of how old is the story, right? Does it go back way further beyond Sumer? Is it within Sumer? Is it pre-Atlantis, pre-flood? We have, written language only came about around that time, even though it was other places in the world. We were also probably at a higher consciousness and had telepathy and other types of communication that we didn't need to write things down. And at one point, verbal communication seemed to be a stronger form of communication and more trustworthy than even writing things down. So we don't see the stories written down for a while, but we see all the way to 7,000 BCE. Okay, that's 9,000 years ago. 9,000 years ago, we have found artifacts that look like Gilgamesh, and here's one of them. Then there was more of these found in the 24th century BCE in inscriptions dedicated to Gilgamesh. There was a pot with inscription photo in the same century that Mesopotamia became an empire. And in the city of Akkad, the Akkadian Empire spoke a Semitic language but worshipped the same gods as the Sumerians. They invaded the south, the Akkadians, and incorporated Sumerian city-states. The empire was passed down to its successors for 200 years. This is after Sumer, we have the Akkadians, and then we have 200 years of the Akkadian rule, and it was the first successfully documented secession. The Naram Sin king brought Akkadian empire to its greatest extent, and after his death, it collapsed into the 22nd century BCE, so that's 2200 BCE. Invaders ruled the area until the end of the century, where the Sumerian king succeeded in creating the second unified state of Mesopotamia. So we have Sumer, we have Akkadians, and we have back to the Sumerian kings. And this was a time of upheaval, wars, and a splitting of these city-states into different areas. And you can see in this map below, we have the Akkadians, we have the Sumerians, we have the Elamites, and they were all most likely part of one cultural people before. The Akkadian and Sumerians. So this is where the Ziggurat, this is what you see below here, the Ziggurat building program took off. Shulgi took control of the new empire and created diplomatic contacts with the surrounding areas. The uniform writing system was created at this time, and Sumerian literature, as well as historical records, were created. This is where we see more evidence of Gilgamesh. Sumerian kings lists were created here as well, and later versions show a descent of Sumer from the heavens and spoke about a great flood and kings before the flood and after. So this is where, as I said, we should start seeing the Sumerians king list during this time of the Ziggurat building. And we see pre and post flood kings lists, which span 241,000 years of rule by 8 kings. Here you go, is the Sumerians kings list. I'll let you guys read that for a second. 208 kings in 200. So one of them had 241,000 years of rule by 8 kings, but this is a bunch of kings dating back way far. So let's talk a little bit about the legitimacy of the kings list. It may have not been historical, but have been propaganda to show how long they lived, and an unbroken line of Sumer in that archaeological evidence does not show. So one of the things that could happen, because a lot of times they do overinflate what they've done, and their egos can take control and say that this is how long we've been around, right? That's one possibility. And the other possibility is it's not about Sumer. It's about some sort of other civilization that exists way longer, and these different kings or rulers or whatever we had back then and who they were. So I'm curious what you guys think about this. Maybe you can tune in to yourself and see what you feel. Is this evidence of ancient list of people with long lifespans? Is it propaganda? Is it both? Is it pre and post flood kings? Did our lifespan possibly reduce after the flood? Some Sumer kings we know existed do not show up there now. So there were some kings that actually were around, but they're not on that list. So that's curious. Why are they taken off? It was periodically revised based on city, state, and dynasty, though. So they kept changing it, right? So it's challenging at times to look at all this stuff because so many updates have been made. Two early rulers were contemporaries of Gilgamesh on the king's list. So Gilgamesh was first mentioned as a god before a king. He was a hybridized giant. He was the king of men. In later Babylonian texts, much of his exploits and descriptions of his quests were removed. They took him out of the stories. Gilgamesh was also mentioned in a later king's list, credited for rebuilding ancient temples. We have uncovered many of these ancient temples that he was created for. In about 2024 BCE, the third dynasty in Ur, we see his exploits of Enkidu covered in detail. So all of a sudden, after not having his information out there about all his stuff, we see his what he did, where he went, his quest, his visit with Noah, boom, came out in quite a lot of description. But a lot of the parts of the tablets are missing, making people speculate or debate over the true meaning of many of the things in the tablets. And then we move down into, we have Sumerian, Akkadian, Neo-Sumerian. Neo-Sumerian Gilgamesh. There are 5 poems in Sumerian, 2 separate versions found. Gilgamesh and the Netherworld. And it spoke about how the gods divided the universe between them and a great storm blows down a willow tree. Inanna takes the tree to Uruk and plants it in Niana's district. The city gets infested and she turns to Gilgamesh for help. He gets rid of the inhabitants and carves a tree into wood for Inanna. Gilgamesh sends his servant to the netherworld and gets detained because he does not show proper respect. And then that's Enkidu, who's his servant. And then Enkidu gets raised from the netherworld. So it's one of the exploits because the journey with Enkidu where he dies wasn't the only one. They had been spending time for a while, and there's many stories around Gilgamesh's life. In the second tale, you have the death of Gilgamesh. He's seized by Namtar, the emissary of death. Enki shows vision of God judging his exploits in a cedar forest. Learned wisdom for Ziggurats, which was the only survivor of the deluge. So we had Utnapishtim, we have Ziggurats, we have Noah. These are just the same person with different names. In a dream, the gods say after he descends to the underworld, he will be given a special place as a judge to the dead. He awakens and seeks counsel and is told not to be sad at his fate. Then the poem talks about the building of his tomb and that Gilgamesh and his wives were sealed in a tomb, and the river is returned to its normal way to cover the tomb. The dead carried out a shadowy existence in the netherworld, except for Gilgamesh, who had a special place in the netherworld. So basically, he went to the underworld and he was given a special place there. He wasn't living a shadowy existence. Ziggurats of Shurappak is listed in WP 62 in the Sumerian kings list, recension as the last king of Sumer prior to the Great Flood. Okay, this is a very interesting point. Ziggurats, aka Noah, aka Utnapishtim, is on the king's list as the last king before the Great Flood. He is subsequently recorded as the hero of the Sumerian creation myth and appears in the writings of Berosus. There we go. The flood over here, and we have the ark at the bottom there. The Nephilim are mentioned just before the flood account as well, in Genesis 6:4, which states, "The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes of old, warriors of renown." I am pretty sure that just by this definition of a Nephilim, Gilgamesh was a Nephilim, giant hybridized being on this planet, known as a hero, warrior renown. That's really much seems like who he was. And this says here, the Nephilim were on the earth before the flood, and they were still there after the flood, right? This guy, this person on this island, Noah there, one of the beings that were there from before and after the flood was still there. People think that Earth was reset, right? That, well, I'm talking about Christian people, right? And Jewish and Islamic, I guess, if you believe the religion, the text there, that the Earth was reset and Noah and his family and the animals are the only people left. But it says here in the Old Testament, the Nephilim were on Earth in those days and also afterwards. According to Hesiod, the giants were the offspring of Gaia, which is Earth, born from the blood that fell with Uranus, sky, that was castrated by his son Titan, son of Cronus, right? And there's so much symbolism here. We can do days and days of symbolism connections because the Titans connects to the giants, the hybridized beings, also connects to Gilgamesh and the ancient Sumerian pantheon of gods, the Greek gods, the Titans, and the Sumerian gods, and many more over the world. Archaic and classical representations show Gigantes as a man-sized hoplites, which is a heavily armed ancient Greek foot soldier, fully in human form. So we're talking about hybridization, and we're talking about the daughters of men and the sons of God. Who are the sons of God? Well, this is another one of my first realizations. I, got into this information, searching on the internet for a root of all religion. I find the Sumerian scriptures. I stumble onto Jordan Maxwell very quickly, like within the first year of me looking into this stuff. And I watched this, like, I don't even know how many, like maybe like 10, 11 part series, hours each, of the sons of God. And who are the sons of God? Well, they are the fallen angels. Now, from 23 years later, I'm realizing that this story has repeated in many situations, and the fallen angels, it's almost like the archetype of the fallen angels have occurred many different times on this planet, including the fall from grace, fall of Atlantis, the fall from these angels falling from grace, the fall from the Garden of Eden, the fall from the Sumerian Garden of Eden. Like, that term seems to be archetypal and also literal. It's an archetype and literal reality that occurs in many different ways. Maybe the last iteration of this was the fallen angels of the sons of God and the Anunnaki. The fallen angels were the second tier of gods that lived alongside the Anunnaki. So something, unless you do research on this, that you might not be aware of, is that on Nibiru, the planet of the Anunnaki, there were two sets of gods, different species of gods, different hominids, if you will, different Homo species. And one of them was called the Igigi. Both of them came and visited Earth together because they came from the same planet. Could Gilgamesh be the offspring of the fallen angels with the daughters of men? So the fallen angels were the Igigi that were left here on the planet when the Anunnaki left. They're basically like the demigods of old. And so that whole story is that the Anunnaki basically left, the Igigi stayed on the planet, whether they were forced to stay, whether they were abandoned, whether they chose to stay, I don't know. And they became the fallen angels because they fell from the skies onto Earth with higher dimensional awareness and knowledge, or just technological knowledge, maybe even. And they're the ones that were started mating with the daughters of men, creating the sons of gods. When he met Zirasudra, Gilgamesh, the immortal, met him. When Gilgamesh met Ziusudra, the immortal, he spoke about the flood in which the Nephilim were on Earth before and after. They had demigod qualities and superhuman strength. So were these the Igigi? Many references of gods or humans or hybrids in ancient texts. And what happened in Greek text when the fallen angel, the sons of gods, right, the other tier of gods, the second tier, mated with the daughters of men? We had the Titans. Who are the Titans? The giants, also known as the Nephilim. So, and the story of Gilgamesh is that kind of similar story as well. In the book of Enoch, we list the leaders of 200 fallen angels. These are the fallen angels who allegedly commenced an unnatural union with human women. In so doing, the actions resulted in hybrid offspring that they allegedly taught humans the forbidden knowledge. Some are also listed in the Book of Raziel, the Zohar, and the Book of Jubilees. So in the final stretch here, we have actually we have a good 10 minutes. Let me just do a quick check. Oh yeah, we'll finish it all. Let's talk about the Igigi. The story of Atrahasis, the Babylonian story of the flood, and a precursor to the flood story in the Gilgamesh epic, offers some evidence on the relationship between the Anunnaki and the Igigi. The poem begins with the lines, "When the gods, like men, bore the work and the suffered the toil of the gods were great." We'll break this down as we go. Gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toil. This is when the gods, the Igigi, so the Igigi basically were the workers. I don't know if they weren't slaves, they just were the ones that were instructed to come down and do the work on Earth, do the mining or whatever they were doing on this planet. And the toil of the gods were great, the Igigi. The work was very heavy. The distress was very much. The composition continues to say, the seven, here we go again, seven, great Anunnaki were making the Igigi suffer the work. What follows is partly fragmentary, but seems to indicate that the Igigi gods did not want to work anymore, and therefore the Anunnaki had to find a solution. So it didn't seem that they were forced. They kind of like went up to the Anunnaki and said, hey, this is still a little too much for us. Can we find some other way to do this? Ultimately, this led to the creation of humans, hybridization, with the help of Anunnaki and Igigi working together. Some say the Igigi were actually the geneticists between our hybridization, who from then on had to bear the gods' work. In this story, it appears that the Igigi were subordinate to the Anunnaki, but it's unclear which deities were included in this group. Genesis 1:26 to 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on earth." And the Sumerian version, Nima will bind upon it the image of the gods. It is man. So we have here two opposing views of creationism and evolution. So could it be both? By the politicization and religiousification of these beliefs, we are unable to see the middle ground. So what I'm saying here is that we have two beliefs in the world predominantly. We have evolution. Humans evolved over millions of years. We were Homo erectus, then we were Homo sapien, even though we don't see how we transitioned from Homo erectus to Homo sapien. And then the other one is we were planted and seeded. Well, the truth always almost lies somewhere in between. And it seems that, by keeping us conflicted on both sides, we're both trying to argue these different sides, the religious side and evolutional side, scientific and religious. But it seems like we were evolving as a species on this planet. And that at one point there was an interaction, interference, manipulation, I don't know what you want to call it, but there was some sort of occurrence that happened that created a genetic mutation within humanity that shifted our whole entire being basically in a very short period of time, a quantum leap within days, months, year, very, very short period of time. That it looks like that we had some sort of influence coming externally that did this to us. And here in the Anunnaki text, and also in the book of Genesis, is actually implying to that there was a hybridization, a genetic mutation. Let us make a man in our image after our likeness literally comes from the Sumerian text talking about let us come down to earth, let's mine this planet. All right, let's figure out how we can make these beings in our image and our likeness so that they can do the work for us, right? And there's even all types of metaphors and descriptions within the Sumerian text that kind of looked like they were actually doing a scientific experiment. Enki, and here is the text that does that. Enki thinks of germinating powers of the clay and water of the abyss. And he tells Namu to have some womb goddesses pinch off this clay and thicken it so she can mold it to give birth to humans. So I have a presentation I did on hybrid ETs, and it's half of it's the science of hybridization, genetics, and then the other half is like the ancient stories. And within that, I have a whole bunch of slides, or a couple of slides just dedicated to the stories of clay in ancient civilizations. And it seems that all the stories, or many, if not almost all of them, quite a lot of them, that are speaking about clay are actually ancient stories that are speaking about some sort of scientific experiment or maybe a genetic creation. And the clay stories are almost always, if not always, because I've only found this to be the case. But since I haven't read everything, I can't say it's always. That it's speaking about clay in the form of creating life. And here is the example from the Sumerian scriptures. So if you ever have wondered what is the text that people look at when they look at the Sumerian scriptures in order to realize that we may be genetically hybridized, here's a part of it. Mix the heart of the clay that is over the abyss. The good and princely fashioners will thicken the clay. You, Namu, do you bring the limbs into existence? Nima, Earth Mother, will work above you. The goddesses of birth will stand by you at your fashioning. O my mother, decree it, the newborn's fate. Nima will bind upon it the image of the gods. It is man. Without sperm of a male, she gave birth to the offspring of the embryo of mankind. How the god Nima basically created us. Nima could have been the geneticist. So the 7th century now, so we're in the home stretch here. Ancient Babylon in the 7th century BCE, that's 1700 BCE, grew into a large city. Huge kingdoms and continual warfare throughout Mesopotamia. In 1766 BCE, city-states came together and conquered other states. Written language and literature continued to evolve until about the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Sumerian was the dominant language in that area. Akkadian then became the #1 language to the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean soon after. And this, so I give you the little timeline there. I hope you're noticing I'm just doing a timeline up from 7000 BCE up until kind of more modern. But so around 1766, right, we already spoke about 4,000 or 5,000 years of history in that area. Now we have Sumerian still being utilized and around. So it's like it's had a good 5,000 years stretch of this culture and these stone tablets and stories of Gilgamesh and ancient kings lists and Anunnaki and Nephilim and being created in the image of the gods. All this stuff is coming from there, right? About ancient stories, okay? I feel that this was passed down either verbally or they found some other ancient cylinder scrolls as well. And then we have Akkadian takeover, that's a Semitic language, and then all of a sudden we see that through the Middle East and Mediterranean. And this is right around the time we see a unified story of Gilgamesh. So it's all these stories, all these different things he did, and the entire story of prehistory put together from the fragments. Kind of like how the Bible was 500 years later, we start seeing the New Testament come together 500 years after Yeshua's life. And this is what's happening here. Thousands of years later, we're finally seeing a unified story of Gilgamesh. So we're going to close out with what I love to close out presentations with. Why is this important? The story of Gilgamesh inspired many stories of ancient religions and cultures that came later, including Hercules and heroes from the Odyssey and Noah. His exploits to the cedar forest in modern Lebanon, Babylonia, and south to the Persian Gulf. So he traveled a lot of the world. There's a story of companionship, love, and human struggle against mortality as well embedded in that. Possibly connects to the extraterrestrial influence of humanity, giants, the Nephilim, the Igigi, hybridization, the Anunnaki. the sons of God. By the time the most famous version of his story was composed in the late second millennia BCE, his exploits were already known for at least 1,000 years, but definitely, I feel, thousands of years more verbally passed down. We saw evidence of a stone structure of him from 7,000 BCE. Objects were dedicated to him at the beginning of prehistory, further suggesting this was an ancient story of a great flood, possibly 11,900 BCE. And that is the journey from ancient Sumer to Gilgamesh. So thank you all for tuning into that.